this is my site, site number 7. And yeah, Ronnie said it's bonkers, but testing ideas, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll share with you my vision for this site, or a vision of new way of life. So I think sharing is actually key to reduce build-up of usage and our consumption, especially in this area of materialism, where people constantly wants to own more, and materials are often equated as status. So I view this design exercise as a way to deconstruct this materialistic view on society, and in a way try to teach people to let go of things that they no longer need, and thus reducing their carbon footprint. So I began this design exercise by looking at data from Oxford City Council. And in this site, actually, 56% of home occupants are single dwellers. So even though there's a lot of like 2-story houses, they actually live alone in the house. And when I went to the site, a lot of the front yard, they appears to be unused, and some of the upper floors, like I can see the windows are being blocked off with like timber planks, so probably it's not being used either. And a lot of the sub-basement, it's either used for storage of things they no longer need, or it just remains empty, it's not used. And I dug further into reports from Oxford City Council that says that 30% of energy usage is actually from residential. And out of this 30%, 80% of the energy actually comes from privately rented housing. So it brings me to question whether one person needs this much space, and whether they should be giving up space for the greater good. So my proposal for this site is actually creating dwellings for single users or single owners. So okay, and the idea is that this is intended to provide them the space that they need in all the smaller units, and that they share more public spaces like kitchen, workspace, and also living spaces. So the idea is that these houses are converted into sort of like a public kitchen for all of these people. And I also found out that these buildings are from the early 20th century, and with insulation being relatively less effective in terms of the glazings and also the roof, I'm trying to take advantage of it, where when people cook in this kitchen, the heat is sort of like it's not contained within the buildings, but it's released to supply heat to all of these units. So the idea is that here is going to be like another center of kitchen, so that's going to be like their source of heat for this set of housing. So, and also I found out that energy used from doing laundry is also emitting heat, so maybe we could also use that to power to keep these units warm when they need it. And of course, to encourage people to leave their original homes and move into these spaces, I incorporated facilities which they might not have in their previous house, like gym facilities, communal spaces where they could like work together, or meeting spaces if they need to be. And yeah. And then because I sort of force people into smaller spaces than they were in previously, I designed a sharing deposit, this area, which they could deposit the things that they don't use as frequent, and it sort of become like their neighborhood sharing center. So people who has the need for it, they don't have to go out and buy a new one. They could actually just borrow it from their neighbors, and in a way it fosters a closer knit community. And I see that it's a smaller step, a smaller lead to a bigger cause, I think, because by having this deposit, you could also share knowledge, and you could also share like ways to actually reduce your carbon footprint in your daily life. And if we have all of this neighborhood living a relatively low carbon footprint life, then it's like one segment is settled, and it's just time to bring it to another segment, and eventually, hopefully, all of Italy Road will be low carbon. Okay. And in terms of technology that I consider is that these units, they are broken up so that they could receive daylight, all of it, so it reduces the need to use artificial lighting. So that's why they're not like next to each other, so you could just like. So yeah, that's the idea. Like you could get lights into your units, and also I incorporated PV for each unit, so it will be able to power up those units, and if it has surplus energy, then it could just be distributed within its cluster. Okay, yeah. So, okay. So throughout my proposal, like thinking process, I recognize actually there's a lot of issues, which is sort of just like questioning myself. So the first one that I didn't consider is that the byproduct of cooking or using the kitchen is not just heat, but it's also oil, it's also water vapor, it's also odor and all sorts of stuff. So maybe that's something I will look on forward. And also in terms of its effectiveness, whether a kitchen heat from kitchen can actually warm up all of the spaces, and does it mean that if the heat from here is what it takes to keep people warm, does it mean that people will use the kitchen more, people will cook more, and that just means that it sort of like generate more carbon eventually? So I think that's a major flaw that I've analyzed while I was thinking, but it could also be an advantage during the summertime, because when you're cooking and it starts to get hotter and you don't want it, people sort of have internal awareness that maybe they should stop cooking mindlessly and sort of like plan ahead so that their space doesn't get hot eventually. Yeah. And also the major one is that the greenhouse effect through the external world, because I sort of created a glazing here to contain the heat for just the cluster, but didn't really consider the effect that it would be like if the heat is released outside and not reused for this. And also for the church here, I looked up into retrofitting. So it's possibly it would be to change the glazings and also improve insulation. And right now, if the road is just used on the weekends for events and some religious ceremonies, so maybe it could also be adapted into like community space where you can, I guess. Yeah, that's it.
You've done it for us.
Thank you. Oh. So yeah. Wait, so yeah, I was just analyzing my stuff, whether the kitchen works or not. So that's the initial idea, that maybe the kitchen's in the center. That's the center of heat. Maybe it's not at the bottom, but I decided to go with this one anyway because it's sort of like preserving what's already there. And maybe the kitchen could be broken up into several. It could be broken up into several spots instead, or like that's like first idea. That's like the ring, or maybe it could be broken up like it could be here and here, so you have like different concentrated spots of heat to warm up. So it's not like So.
I think you need to let yourself off the hook a little bit. You've come up with a concept.
Okay.
Haven't you? Of this kind of, you acknowledge that heat has been created and you want to capture it and you want to use that.
Yeah.
And you haven't quite figured out how you're going to do that yet, but you have that concept. I think that's fine. You know, in a week you can't figure all of that out with everything else that you're doing as well. So I think conceptually that's something that when you work on your next sites that you become aware of when you're working. The thing that really, again, the thing that struck me, the first thing you said was about status.
Mm-hmm.
And how and deconstructing what we attach status to, and that is something I feel really, really passionate about, and I'm so pleased that you brought that up, because and I'm going to quote my dad now. It's really funny because he loves cars. He loves really stylish cars, which is hilarious because cars he owns are not stylish, but he appreciates it. And he says when he was a little boy, he thought of the future. He thought cars would be really streamlined and elegant and beautiful. He couldn't wait to see the cars in the future. And now he's sorry, no offence to everyone who's, I'm sure, parents and maybe even themselves own these cars, but now he is literally flabbergasted by the cars that people assign status to nowadays. They are enormous, they are cumbersome, they are contradictions of themselves, they are fuel guzzling, they are everything that is really not beautiful about design, in his opinion. But they're status symbols, you know, some of these cars that people drive around in are status symbols. And that was constructed by marketing, by business owners, by whoever. That whole putting the status symbol on those things was a construction created by somebody. Therefore, we can deconstruct that just as easily as we can build it. And so I don't know where you can take that, but you brought that up, and it's something that I feel very passionate about. And if it's something that you can address within your architecture somehow, then please do. And the other thing I got me thinking about is, we don't have to answer this, but who you think your client might be. And I say that because you're creating new housing. And lots of people talk about providing housing for homelessness, so maybe it's something that Ronnie, Shahi and I have to talk about. But Oxford has a big shortage of housing. And actually, Oxford City Council, I get access to some, I don't know if it's public or not, but they actually own a lot of land in Oxford. They actually still own a lot of houses. People think that there's no council housing left. It's not true, there is actually quite a lot, but there's not enough. And in practice, we get there at the moment, we've got quite a few sites around the city that the council are desperately trying to develop so that we can provide more council housing, social housing. But there's not enough, there's a real shortage of land in Oxford, a real shortage of sites. And so this concept is creating kind of sites in the sky. So you could argue that the council is your client and you're trying to show them actually you do have this, you've kind of created land for them by bringing these buildings into cover, elevating them. But what I quite like is the fact that they're not big skyscrapers, they're still, permeable, you can kind of see through them, they're not these kind of really big dominating structures. So you've kind of redesigned it that way. So you were saying people would be moving out, but I was thinking people are just moving in, you're just creating new houses. I suppose you were referring to redeveloping the bits that
moving out from there.
Okay.
There's actually the idea that I wanted this to be humble is because the tower of the church, you can see it's iconic with the green spire. So it's the only church from the 12th century Norman architecture that uses flint as the material. So it sort of gives a cultural significance. So I think it's worth toning this down.
And that's the type of thing like the drawing that Shahi was encouraging guys. You can the annotate because that level of thinking we don't know is there. So that's why it's so beautiful the way that you can annotate these models in that way to show that annotate. Say I'm preserving this view. Very quickly, two more things, or just one more thing I wanted to say was about this library that you were talking about. That's something that I feel very strongly about. Everybody knows this. When I finished my masters, I set up a startup. It's called Tundy, and it was basically enabling people to share the knowledge. That was all it was about, and I was doing it 4 or 5 years ago. And now the closest I can think, because I didn't manage to get it off the ground, but the closest I can find exists. It's called Fat Llama. I still don't think it's that successful though. But there is also the sharing library. Makerspace. I think. Do you know about the share library? Okay.